Good afternoon, good evening to you wherever you are in our global audience. I'm Bob McConnell, co-founder of the U.S. Ukraine Foundation and Director of External Relations for the Foundation's Friends of Ukraine Network, and I welcome you to today's webinar on a very timely topic. Crimea in Ukraine's control is key to any genuine peace and prosperity. The history of Vladimir Putin's war against Ukraine really began as soon as he took over from Boris Yeltsin. Putin's efforts to undermine Ukraine began when, through numerous mentions, certainly including misinformation and infiltration of the government and institutions in Kiev, as well as his pursuit of his larger designs to reestablish the Russian Empire. His use of force in pursuit of his aims began in 2008 in Georgia, and then 2014 in Crimea and Donbass. In each case, the extent the United States responded, that response was timid and ineffective. And as we know, bad behavior unchecked leads to more bad behavior. Indeed, it leads to an escalation of bad behavior, and that's exactly what happened and where we're at. We're now into the second year of Putin's full-scale, unprovoked, and evil war. Satellite-provided news shows the entire world the Russian war crimes. More recently, the media has begun covering the genocide of Ukrainian children and women. If you watch the reports, you see genuine evil at work. During World War II, the public was not confronted in real time with the Nazi horrors. Today is different. The demonstrable evil is right there in front of us, brutal and undeniable. And yet it seems the high watermark of American outrage and support for Ukraine has passed or is passing. Poll numbers show support waning. Prominent and less prominent politicians, all of whom should know better, are speaking out against continued support for Ukraine. Despite what the administration has done and is doing, the White House has yet to make the unequivocal case to the public for why Ukraine winning this war is in our own American national security interests, why we must support Ukraine winning this war. And now, in the public discussion, the need for negotiations to end the war is building without, in my view, clear-headed, rational analysis of the circumstances of the war on the ground. In these discussions, Crimea is being treated as simply a piece of real estate, not recognizing its critical strategic importance to Ukraine and the West. Putin has always seen Crimea as a critical strategic value. He has invested extraordinary resources to occupy and militarize the peninsula. Just a couple of examples. In 2003, Russia began to build a dam in the Kerch Strait to connect with Ukraine's Tuzla Island. During the Yushchenko presidency in Ukraine, Russia increased support for pro-Russian and anti-Western political parties and organizations in Crimea. It also boosted anti-Western and pro-Russian propaganda on Russian cable TV channels for Crimea. Of course, Putin started handing out Russian passports. Actually, handing them out doesn't sound quite as aggressive as what was going on, even before his little green men invaded. And then there was, of course, the Kalashnikov monitored referendum in 2014. Putin knows Crimea's strategic value as to Russia dominating Ukraine and indeed the region. We in the United States need to think realistically and strategically about this war and about Crimea. And today we have an excellent panel to discuss these issues. You should have a question and answer link on your Zoom screen, and you can post questions during the discussion. I'm not sure we'll be able to handle all questions, but we will make the effort. Now our panel. Ambassador John Herbst, former U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, now head of Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. Retired General Ben Hodges, former commander of all U.S. Army troops in Europe and now with Human Rights First. Ambassador Sandy Vershbow, former U.S. Ambassador to Russia and former Deputy Secretary of NATO. Ian Brzezinski, former Department of Defense official with responsibilities related to NATO. Deborah Kagan, career State Department diplomat and Defense Department official, now Distinguished Fellow at the Transatlantic Leadership Network. And Luke Coffey, Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute. Let's start with you, Ian. What about the U.S. strategic interest in helping Ukraine defeat the Kremlin?
Thanks, Bob, and thank you for organizing this and for all you've done in support of Ukraine. A lot is at stake in this conflict. And I know we're focusing on Crimea this morning, but let me back up a little bit and remind us what's been going on. You know, Crimea, just talking about Crimea reminds me that this is a nearly decade-long war that Russia launched against a democratic European state. That war, of course, started in 2014 with the invasion of Crimea, and then later portions of eastern Ukraine. And this war has been burning steadily on ever since then. And the February 22nd, 2022 invasion was, the attempt to seize the entirety of Ukraine was a massive escalation of this 10-year war. So what's at stake? Well, I think there are basically 5 things at stake. First and foremost is Ukraine's sovereignty and independence. This is the sovereignty and independence of one of Europe's most democratic, pluralistic, and politically tolerant societies in Europe. And moreover, the ambitions of Putin are not just acquiring territory to create a new version of the Russian Empire, to avenge the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He's seeking literally to erase by force the history and identity of the Ukrainian people, to deny their very existence as a nation. This is an atrocity at a scale that we haven't seen since World War II. Second, what Putin's doing by violating Ukraine's territory, brutally invading it, is he's eroding, he's literally walking over the rules-based international order that has been the basis of peace and prosperity since World War II. And if he's allowed to get away with this, it will significantly weaken that order that has been such an important part and fabric of international relations over these last several decades. We will be at risk of sliding back into a world dominated by spheres of influence, military coercion, a world where might makes right. Putin will be emboldened to act against other nations along Russia's periphery, even NATO states. Other autocrats like China will be emboldened. And when you think about Crimea, for anyone who's thinking or contemplating about some deal in which Crimea is left with Russia, really risks making that peninsula a 21st century monument to the potential gains of imperialism. Third, the role of nuclear weapons in international affairs is going to be affected by the outcome of this conflict. A key element of Putin's strategy has been to exercise nuclear coercion. It's the first thing he did when he launched that war, is he signaled and communicated through action and rhetoric that he has nuclear weapons and the West intervenes, they could be used. And the West's reaction in the face of those threats was to pledge no boots on the ground, to express repeatedly determination to avoid World War III and to keep NATO out of this conflict. When you reward coercion, you invite it to happen again, and we've seen that actually happen in this conflict with repeated exercise of nuclear coercion by Putin, repeated nuclear threats. And allowing this precedent to prevail will risk encouraging not only similar actions by the Kremlin in the Ukrainian theater and elsewhere, but it will also encourage other adversaries armed with nuclear weapons to exercise nuclear coercion, and will encourage other states to actually pursue the development of nuclear arsenals. So it's a real proliferation threat. Fourth, NATO's credibility is at stake. What the alliance does and it does not do in support of Ukraine, a NATO partner has contributed to NATO operations, a NATO partner that NATO said intends to bring into its ranks of membership, what NATO does and doesn't do will shape the confidence of its own member states in the institution and its partners, and also the respect that the alliance garners among its adversaries. As I said, it's troubling to me that Putin has been able to sideline the role of NATO as an institution from supporting Ukraine. Today, NATO serves at most as a consultative forum. It has no real role in providing supplies to Ukraine, even humanitarian supplies. It's not involved in providing weapons. It's not involved in training Ukrainian soldiers. I think that really needs to change. And then fifth and finally, I think a big factor at stake here is Russia's own evolution. Its own evolution as a potential democracy and a constructive actor in the international order. My dad, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was a Sovietologist. And following the end of the Cold War, he used to emphasize that Russia cannot be a democracy if it continues to be an empire. And if Putin's aggression is not fully reversed, I think you can make a strong case that Russia's own prospects of evolving to a more constructive international actor, if not democracy, will be severely diminished. So just looking forward very briefly, we need to support Ukraine more decisively. That means first and foremost supporting clearly and unambiguously Ukraine's territorial definition of success in this conflict, i.e. the full reconstitution of its territorial sovereignty back to internationally recognized borders, including Crimea. It means accelerating the delivery, increasing the capabilities of the military supplies we deliver. It means increasing NATO's contribution to the support of Ukraine, NATO as an institution. And it really means putting the hammer down on economic sanctions on Russia. With that, I turn the floor back to you, Bob.
Okay, thanks, Ian. Luke, what are your thoughts about the importance and the vulnerability of Crimea specifically?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Bob, for inviting me, and thanks to the U.S. Ukraine Foundation for putting this together. Crimea is integral to Ukraine's territorial integrity. This was reaffirmed in 1991 during a referendum where every region in Ukraine was asked if they would like to join the new independent Ukraine or remain or join the Russian Federation. And every oblast, every region in Ukraine voted a majority to be part of a new Ukraine. Even Crimea voted to do so. If this conflict ends with Ukraine not having full control of Crimea, then this will set a very dangerous precedent going forward around the world. And let's not forget that the last time a country invaded another country to annex its territory was Saddam Hussein in 1990 when he invaded Kuwait. So this isn't something that we've seen since the post Second World War era very often. And that's why this specific example, being the first case of territorial annexation by the use of force in the 21st century, is so important to what Ian described as the rules-based order that we benefit from today. Secondly, Ukraine can never truly be safe without having Crimea under its full control. We already know today that Russia is using Ukraine as a safe area to refit and restore and repair broken equipment, burnt out tanks, armored vehicles, etc. If there was some sort of ceasefire settlement that allowed Russia to remain in control of Crimea and essentially froze that aspect of the conflict, you could bet that Russia would be using Crimea in the same way, but on steroids, to rearm, refit, re-equip, so that someday they can once again attack the rest of Ukraine. Imagine, a situation where an American adversary, an American enemy, invaded the U.S. and was allowed at the end of the conflict to keep control of Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina. We would find this completely unacceptable. And all this nonsense about, well, Crimea is not really Ukraine, it's always been Russia. This has been debunked a million times. I don't need to do it here. But Crimea is part of Ukraine in the same way that, Florida is part of the United States. So it would be completely unacceptable for us. And we should also assume that and understand why this sort of arrangement would be completely unacceptable to the Ukrainians. Also, Crimea can never be economically prosperous or secure unless it is fully under the control of Ukraine. History tells us that Crimea is economically and geographically linked to the rest of Ukraine. In a topographical sense, Crimea is merely an extension of the Ukrainian steppes. Administratively, when the Crimean Khanate before Catherine the Great annexed Crimea in 1783, the Crimean Khanate controlled not only the Crimean Peninsula, but also the bits of southern Ukraine in Zaporizhia and Kherson and parts of Donetsk as part of that Khanate, because these two geographical regions not only were connected together geographically, but were connected together economically and had to work as one economic unit. Let's not forget that Crimea has no physical connection other than a newly built bridge to the Russian Federation. It is intimately linked to the rest of Ukraine. It's physically linked to the rest of Ukraine, and it's economically linked to the rest of Ukraine. And it has to be under Ukraine's control for that region to really have the prosperity and stability that it needs. But these are the reasons why it matters for Ukraine. And I'll sum up here, Bob. The reason why it matters to the United States is that Crimea is used by Russia as a springboard to launch military operations outside of the region, whether this is in the Eastern Med, or this is with Syria, or even some of Russia's activities in Libya. Crimea allows Russia to exert influence in the broader region. And this is why it's in the direct US interests that Ukraine restores its sovereign control over Crimea, to deny Russia this ability to militarize this peninsula to their geopolitical advantage. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Luke. Sandy, I mean, the subject, I guess I brought it up earlier, of negotiations and stability and so forth has come up. You've been around, diplomat and more. What are your thoughts?
Okay, well, thank you very much, Bob, for organizing this, because I think it is an important moment, both to remember what's at stake and to make sure we've got the right strategy for achieving a victory. And clearly, the war, having entered its second year, looks like it's going on with no end in sight. At the same time, Ukraine has defied everyone's expectations with its valiant defense of Kiev and its remarkable counteroffensives last fall. But in the last few weeks, a new era of pessimism has been dominating the debate, with more and more expressions of doubt about the Ukrainians' ability to take back territory in their long-awaited spring and summer counteroffensive. And many experts and pundits are predicting instead a protracted stalemate that could grind down the Ukrainian armed forces and undermine outside political and financial support. These pessimistic voices, some within the US administration, often anonymous, argue that Ukraine should quit while it's ahead and seek a negotiated solution, with the implication that Ukraine should be prepared to give up territory, starting with Crimea, which is supposedly Putin's legacy and so sensitive, and that trading land for peace is a way to end the killing and allow economic reconstruction to begin. The problem is there's no sign that Putin is at all serious about negotiations, and he has no incentive to get serious. He hasn't scaled back his war aims one bit. He still believes that time is on his side, that he can outlast the Ukrainians and their Western backers. And he believes that Ukraine will ultimately submit to Russian hegemony. And I have to say, he must be very encouraged by the declining support for Ukraine among Republicans in the US Congress, a trend that he's going to try to reinforce with occasional nuclear saber rattling aimed at discouraging the US from providing the capabilities Ukraine needs to prevail. And the downing of the Reaper drone on Tuesday could be a deliberate attempt to intimidate us and our allies and to play on this increasing civil war within the Republican Party that we read about in today's Washington Post. So I think that, and I think all of us on this panel agree that as the summer fighting season approaches, it's time to reaffirm our full support for Ukraine and help the Ukrainians prove the pessimists wrong. We should commit unequivocally to the goal of Ukrainian victory, which we've been reluctant to do since the war began, and we should do everything possible to equip the Ukrainians to finish the job. With additional Western support, Ukraine can take back more occupied territory, and we'll hear shortly from General Hodges on that score. And with more support, we can deny the Russians the fruits of their aggression. But it's also the best way to create conditions in which serious negotiations might actually be able to take place. By helping Ukraine gain the upper hand on the battlefield, we can strengthen Ukraine's hand at the bargaining table and increase the pressure on Russia to end the war on terms favorable to Kiev, or at least make it clear to the rest of the world that Russia, not Ukraine, is the intransigent party. Now, the greatest leverage on Russia would come from enabling Ukraine to put at risk Russian control over Crimea. As others have said, Crimea is the key to military victory, and I'd say it's also the key to a lasting peace. With control over Crimea, Ukraine can become a secure, viable, and prosperous country once again, and a reliable contributor to global peace and stability, including food and energy security. Backed up by effective Western security guarantees that prevent renewed Russian aggression, and that would preferably be NATO membership, Ukraine can peacefully coexist as a neighbor of Russia. If Russia is allowed to keep Crimea, on the other hand, it will be able to prevent Ukraine from becoming a viable state economically, since Russia will be able to block access to all of Ukraine's major ports through its control of Crimea and the northern Black Sea. Moreover, if Russia is allowed to keep Crimea and other territory illegally annexed by force, it will undermine one of the fundamental principles of the rules-based order and set a very bad precedent for other autocrats and rogue states who would be keen to follow Russia's example, most significantly China, trying to settle the Taiwan question by force. And let's remember that Putin has made clear in his statements and in the draft treaties presented to the US and NATO before the war that his ambitions extend beyond Ukraine. And if he gets away with dismembering and subjugating Ukraine, sooner or later, Russia will do to other neighbors what it's done to Ukraine. And that could include even attacking the Baltic states, which Russia still considers historic parts of the Russian Empire, even though they're covered by NATO's Article 5 guarantee. So let me stress that while it's premature to push for negotiations now, I don't oppose negotiations at the appropriate time. But when that time arrives, it's the Ukrainians who must set the goals and the terms of any deal, since they're the ones doing the fighting. And they have good reason to resist giving up any territory in the wake of Russian brutality and war crimes. The realists who say that Ukraine should settle for a return to the status quo prior to February 24th of last year, when the war began, may have a valid case, but it's the Ukrainians who have to address these issues, not us. They offered significant concessions in the talks last March, let's remember, and it was Moscow that walked away, not Kiev. So our role now is to ensure that they have the means to improve their negotiating position on the battlefield. Diplomacy's time may come, but I suspect it will only be when Putin is facing total defeat, including the prospect of losing control over Crimea. Thanks.
Well, thank you, Sandy. I've gotten a note from Ben. He'll be hopefully tying in here in a minute. But in the meantime, Deborah, you often have more facts and data than anybody else I know about both Crimea and nuclear posturing and weapons and what can be done. I'm just anxious to hear what you have to say.
Well, I want to start out by talking about the Pentagon's reaction to Kim Jong-un's threats of nuclear use the other day. I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have it in front of me, but the response from the Pentagon was, if Kim Jong-un continues to threaten nuclear weapons, and if he even thinks about it, he will cease to exist in terms of running his country and the people around him. Now, contrast that with the reaction of this administration to Vladimir Putin's casual use of threatening nuclear weapons on Ukraine, and it's a striking void. There's a huge chasm there. And so I'm wondering where that same bravado is when it comes to Russia threatening nuclear weapons that they've just stated on Kim Jong-un. I think it was 2 days ago. So that's the first thing I'm going to say. The second thing I'm going to say is I'm going to quote a senior Polish official who said, why is it that the closer we are to this conflict geographically, the less afraid we are of nuclear weapons? And why is it that countries who sort of reside west of Berlin are more afraid than we are who have to live in this neighborhood? And I think that's a good way to open this, because we have to be very careful not to adopt Putin's red lines as our own. And I think that's part of this conversation, the Washington Post article that people refer to, other discussions, where we now seem to be accepting as a fait accompli that Vladimir Putin will use a nuclear weapon if we do this, this, and this. And I don't know what this, and this is, because we've, I think, crossed that Rubicon about 15 times already. So, and I still argue that the Russian military itself, no military wants to play in a dirty battle space. And if they were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, remember, it's not Vladimir Putin who makes this ultimate decision on pushing this button. This isn't a strategic weapon. This is a tactical weapon. It would have to be deployed on the battle space by the Russian military. And I really don't think they want to play in a dirty battle space. So I think it's time that we stop this our self-denying of what Russia is going to do. This escalation argument does nothing but encourage Russia to go further. And I'll throw a couple other things out here. Putin met with Assad this week, and they said, we're going to have permanent Russian basing in Syria for the foreseeable whatever future. It's kind of ridiculous statements in Russia, since Russia's continually been in Syria since 1972. And they've never really left. They just plussed up their forces and draw them down and plus them back up again. But this is also, I thought this was interesting, coming on the heels of the shoot down of the Reaper. And it makes a point. And going to what Ian said so eloquently about NATO, I think people forget when they talk about ceding Crimea to Russia, how many other NATO Black Sea nations there are. And a handful of nautical miles down the road sits Romania in the port of Constanța. So are we saying then to Vladimir Putin, it's okay for you to occupy the Black Sea here and continually threaten NATO Black Sea nations? And not even talking about Turkey here, but about Romania, Bulgaria, etc. And I think we forget how close they are. And I'm gonna, instead of going on and on about this, I'm gonna say one other thing about these peace negotiations, if Ambassador Vershbow doesn't mind. We did a little research on this. And historically, there has never been a successful demilitarized zone or peace negotiation without US boots on the ground. And you could look at Korea, you could look at Kuwait, you could look at Berlin, even with the small US forces during the Berlin airlift and then the quadripartite agreement. There has never been a successful peacekeeping negotiation without US boots on the ground. So my question is to people in the administration and others that might be pushing this negotiated settlement, are you prepared to put US boots on the ground in Crimea to keep the peace? Do you think the peace will be kept by Pakistani and Bangladeshi peacekeepers? How the UN does business? Because I think that no one is thinking this through, how this will be enforced. And I mean, look at the Balkans, and there is still an EU mission with US forces all these years later. So I just throw out to people that before you seize this initiative of, gee, this is a good idea, we'll just have some sort of demilitarized zone in Crimea. Remember historically, going back 70 years, that it doesn't work unless US boots on the ground. And I'll end it there.
Well, that's fairly provocative and an interesting fact that needs to be kept in mind. And at least as far as I know, nobody else has even mentioned it or thought about it. General Hodges is working, I'm not sure what it is, but he will be logging in. He has assured me of that. But in the meantime, John,
okay,
you've heard quite a bit. There's a lot to comment on.
I'm going to do something dangerous. I'm going to at least briefly outline what I think Ben will say so the audience has it straight away, and then he will correct me. I've heard him say this privately and publicly many times, so I can get somewhere in the ballpark, but not with his expertise and his gravitas on that issue. Ben's basic point, he's actually led the charge, I would say globally, for why it's imperative that Ukraine take back Crimea. And you've heard from Luke and Deborah and Ian and Sandy some of that, but also how it can be done. And the basic point is relatively simple, which is why I can do this. Ukraine has demonstrated in this year of fighting great ingenuity, speed, and flexibility. All characteristics that one does not find in the Russian army. And armed with weapons from the West, they have been able, A, to defend their capital, defend Kharkiv, defend other cities that were under siege. Ben is joining. I will stop, and Robert, why don't you have Ben address this?
Okay. John was just trying to give a preview
Hodges light
of how Ukraine can take Crimea. And welcome to our group. We've had a lot of interesting things said so far, but we're anxious to hear an update on your thoughts on how Crimea can be returned to Ukraine's possession.
Well, first, let me apologize. I'm embarrassed. I just landed back in Germany this morning. And of course, Germany or Europe does not change daylight savings time the exact same time as the U.S. And I failed to make the conversion. So it's my fault, and I'm embarrassed to be late joining all of you. So how does Ukraine get Crimea? Is that the question I just walked in on?
Yes.
Okay. I was so startled when I saw Luke Coffey's beard. I thought it was Kadyrov there for a minute, one of his Chechen warriors. So okay, so very quickly, Crimea is the decisive terrain of this conflict. The Ukrainians could kill every Russian soldier within 150 miles of Bakhmut. It would not change the strategic outcome. You liberate Crimea, that changes everything. So how do we do this? First, you have to isolate it by severing the two links that connect Crimea to Russia. The first, obviously, the famous Kerch Bridge, and the Ukrainians have already hit it once, and I suspect they'll revisit it again. And then, of course, the other is the so-called land bridge. And the Ukrainians have already demonstrated the ability to hit some bridges around Melitopol. But the purpose is to begin to isolate that peninsula, to start making it very uncomfortable for the Russians who are there. This is going to require more long-range precision weapons. If the Ukrainians had ATACMS, for example, 300 kilometers, they could already be making Sevastopol untenable for the Black Sea Fleet, because it's about exactly 300 kilometers straight line distance from Odessa to Sevastopol. But if they don't have those things, then they've got to get closer with so that they can start using the HIMARS launchers using the GMLRS 90-kilometer range weapons. So we're going to try and isolate Crimea, and then I think sometime this late spring, early summer. Of course, I don't have access, nor should I have access to the General Staff's actual plans. But my sense is that they are building up a very powerful armored force. They're keeping them out of the fight around Bakhmut, because that is not the main effort. That's important, but it's not strategic. They're saving in a very Clausewitzian way. They're building up an armored force. And I think they also are husbanding some of their Air Force to be able to launch a deliberate strike that will break the so-called land bridge, probably somewhere between Melitopol and Mariupol, somewhere in that area. attacking on a narrow front. The fact that the Russians have fortified almost 900 kilometers, that's a great thing because that spreads them out. Ukraine does not have to attack on a 900-kilometer front. I imagine it'll be something more like a 50-kilometer front that could penetrate using tanks, armored engineers, artillery, close air support that will sever that land bridge. And now Crimea is totally isolated. And then you can start bringing up HIMARS using what they already have. And all you got to do is hit Sevastopol, you hit the air base at Saki, you hit the big logistics hub at Zhankoy, hit these places, and then the Russians cannot use Crimea as the launching pad for all the things that they're doing. I think every taxi driver in Kyiv probably knows where everything is on the Crimean Peninsula. There's nowhere to hide. It's about the size of Massachusetts, I think. There's nowhere to hide. We just have to give them the long-range precision strike capability to begin to hit it. And then at some point, they'll have the, I think this will change the dynamic in the Kremlin so significantly that there won't be a lot of enthusiasm for continuing the fighting up in the eastern part of the country, because Crimea actually is all that matters.
Well, now, John, you were going to follow up and pick up where other people have left off. Now you've heard, again, Ben's arguments, so take it away.
And I'm glad I did not have to go through those arguments. So let me just make one point on taking Crimea, which is a very important element of this, is whether Ukraine has the firepower to do this in the coming year. The offensive will start not before the ground hardens after the thaw, which is currently going on in Ukraine. So they have the springtime and summer to launch this. And they've spoken repeatedly that what they need for this, especially, are what experts, which I'm not, experts like Ben and Deborah, call long-range fires, artillery rockets with a range of at least 300 kilometers. They would also like the tanks that have been promised to arrive in time and in sufficient quantity. And they would also like some air support. And for the United States, that means F-16s. And of course, we know that the long-range fires beyond the 85-kilometer HIMARS we're sending, and now perhaps these small bore editions, which can go 150 kilometers, are not quite what they need. And we know that they also are not getting promised those aircraft. So the question is, can they conduct a successful offensive without, and I'll leave that to Ben, but just have it hanging there for further comment. The reason they're not getting those things is a pattern we've seen in the administration since the start of the big invasion and even before, which is to be very careful, too cautious, and I even say timid at times in meeting Ukrainian arms requests. And Deborah laid out the reason for that. They have been spooked by Moscow's very elaborate nuclear bluff. One thing Putin, as a career KGB officer, has learned is how to read people and how to play psychological games. The Russian special services are expert at such games. And you literally have seen the development of a 20-year plus metaphor of Putin as that rat in the corner who will strike out when cornered. And sadly, experts on Russia, not all, but some, and in too many highly placed experts, have bought this dramatic bluff. And Moscow, as part of this, as a you might say, a codicil to this elaborate metaphor, has spoken regularly since the big invasion about perhaps going all in, meaning use of all means of national power, reference to nukes. And it's clear from both press reporting, some things that we've seen, not just through the press, that the administration is concerned that Crimea could be that proverbial red line that would provoke Putin to, in some fashion, use nuclear weapons. Now, I think Deborah already made the important point that if Russia were to use tactical nukes, that would not stop the Ukrainians. It would not be all that successful. But still, people are worried about that. They forget that we're a nuclear power too, and we never let nuclear bluff in Soviet days, and the Soviet Union was far more dangerous to us than Putin's Russia is, deter us from stoutly defending our interests, whether during the Berlin crisis of 61 or the Cuba Missile Crisis of 62. Ian made an important point in describing our interest in this conflict when he said that if in fact Putin winds up quote unquote winning, and that would only happen, by the way, if American support goes down substantially. Despite my criticism of the Biden administration, they have done certainly an adequate job in dealing with Putin's aggression against Ukraine, because Putin cannot win as long as we do at least what we've been doing. And they deserve praise for that, because what they've done is actually quite a bit, if still not as bold and strong and as decisive as American interests require. But the point is that the whole world is watching this, most importantly in Beijing. And there is numerous reporting that as a result of Putin's successful nuclear bluff, the Chinese are absolutely determined to become a pure nuclear power. And this points to the problems of what I call ad hoc foreign policy. One of the reasons the administration has not been as stalwart and energetic in dealing with Putin in Europe is because they say the main game is China and Asia. Yet, by their timidity in this crisis, they are telling the Chinese to go all in on nukes so they can then use the same tactic against us vis-a-vis Taiwan. So you see how the administration, even with its focus on China, is handcuffing itself as a result of not dealing resolutely with Putin's aggression in Ukraine. That's a problem. Now, last point. So do you all understand that I'm an equal opportunity critic? I'm not a partisan critic. Biden's policy is at least adequate. And if this continues ad infinitum, Putin will lose, albeit it will take more time. But there's a danger as a result of political developments in the United States that our policy could weaken. And this is the problem, a much more dangerous problem if it comes to pass, with the isolationist wing of the Republican Party. Now, another unintended nasty consequence of administration timidity on nukes is that the first talking point coming from the isolationist wing of the Republican Party, a very small wing still, is that, gee, the danger is we could wind up in a nuclear confrontation with Russia. So the administration is empowering inadvertently the guys who have a policy preference which will be disastrous for American interests. All the more reason why the administration needs to be more resolute, provide Ukraine the long-range fires, the F-16s, and other things, so that Ben's analysis, which is brilliant, becomes American policy and an American victory. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you, John. I mean, there's so much that's been said here. We do have some questions, but I've got to believe we've got some things going back and forth between our panelists too. Ben, I mean, you've talked about, you know, how to do it and so on and so forth, but in others, including John just now, I mean, we have been doing a good job of keeping Ukraine in the fight, but we have not given them what they need to win the war. And you're talking, I mean, I think everything that you're projecting, the ability for Ukraine to take Crimea and therefore dominate the war and take a victory, we still need to provide them things we're not providing them yet. And as one of our other members who's not on this thing says, you know, it's the right weapon at the right place at the right time. Are we going to get them there?
So as everybody on this panel, I think, has said numerous times before, what's lacking from the administration is clarity about our strategic outcome. I mean, to say that we're with them for as long as it takes is not a strategic outcome. That's avoidance of declaring a strategic outcome. And of course, the ambassadors that are on this call have had a hand in helping to craft American foreign policy objectives before. That is one of the hardest things, to make very clear, this is what we want to achieve in this particular situation. And they just haven't done it. Once they say, we want Ukraine to win, and that means, of course, full restoration of all sovereign territory, then all the excuses about, oh, it'll take too long to train, or this tank burns too much fuel, or we don't have enough, all those excuses fall away. But they can't bring themselves to say that yet. At the Munich Security Conference, I had a chance to talk to, let's just say, a that's three very senior defense official who said, who had a view. And then I also spoke to another very senior, person from the Joint Staff that said they don't need F-16s, or Crimea is not an important logistics base for what the Russians are doing in the East. And I'm like, they completely missed the whole point. So there's nobody in the Pentagon, I shouldn't say nobody, but the leadership in the Pentagon is not thinking about Crimea as the decisive terrain. I mean, when the secretary says we want to give the Ukrainians what they need to push the Russians back, that's the opposite of that. I mean, that's 1917 linear thinking. Instead of what's decisive, we take risk over here so that we can get the decisive terrain that changes everything. This is classic Clausewitzian thinking instead of the linear thinking that I hear coming from, and these are friends that everybody on this call knows. Now, I think that what we have not provided to the Ukrainians is the adequate long-range precision strike capability that they would need to accomplish what I suggested. And they're not going to, as long as they don't think that Crimea is the decisive terrain. And so another person that I spoke to at Munich, who, let's say he's a very senior executive for one of the top investment firms in the world, said there will be no investment in Ukraine unless Ukraine has an ironclad security guarantee. So that means, for sure, as long as Russia controls Crimea, the Ukrainians will never be able to use their ports on Azov Sea, even if Berdyansk and Mariupol are completely liberated. Odessa will never be able to do what it's supposed to do for this export economy, as long as Russia sits there in Crimea. And then, of course, everybody knows that this will be the start point for the next Russian-Ukrainian conflict, whether it's 1, 2, 3 years from now. So as long as Russia occupies Crimea, there's no investment, which means that the 4+ million Ukrainian refugees that live here in Germany or Poland or the Netherlands will continue to have to stay out here. The millions of people that depend on Ukrainian grain will still be waiting on it unless a Russian inspector allows a ship to depart. So if we think beyond just purely operational, where I already think that Crimea is the decisive terrain from a strategic sense, Crimea is the decisive terrain, but the Pentagon is not thinking about it that way. And so that's why they say things like, well, they don't really need F-16s yet, or they don't need ATACMS, or, I mean, or they say things like, well, the Ukrainians are using up too much ammunition. They need to change their, their approach to doing this. Now, to do this, what doctrinally would be called a penetration here, once the ground is dried and hard on a very narrow frontage, I think it will be a comprehensive, not just tanks leading the way, but there's going to be partisans and special forces deep on the other side of where this penetration is headed. I think that the Ukrainian Air Force is actually saving up pilots and aircraft for this. You know, our friend Sam Gardner is such a good air power analyst, and he's calculated that they're only generating about 10% of the sorties that they could if they made that the priority. I think that they are saving up aircraft for what they need to do here come late May or in June. But it is going to take the administration. I hate talking about specific platforms because then you get twisted up about how much time it takes or how hard it is to use that particular system, instead focusing on capabilities. But the kind of systems that do provide that capabilities, we've already talked about ATACMS, we've talked about F-16s. Deborah has schooled me on the ground launch small diameter bombs, and also the Gray Eagle drone with a 25-hour loiter time. I mean, there are capabilities out there that could deliver the effect that Ukraine needs, but the administration has to say, yes, we're going to do that.
Thanks, Ben. Others can jump in, but Deborah, you know, one of the things that keeps coming up in articles and in discussions and webinars and so forth is we've depleted our resources and we're down to where we can't send things. I'd appreciate your comment on that.
You know, that's very interesting. You know, throughout the years, I've had many discussions with senior defense officials and the like about is something because of something or in spite of something. And I think what Ukraine has caused is this reevaluation, not just in the United States, but throughout most Western countries, of their lack of preparedness for any conflict. And so there is that causal relationship, not because of the expenditure of weapons in Ukraine, but because of how ill prepared they are for future conflicts. And I think there's been this tendency in the United States, as well as in many NATO countries, and even in some of our Pacific allies, to sort of sit on your laurels for a really long time. So this happened after Vietnam, and then to build back up took over a decade. It's happened multiple times. And then after the withdrawal from Afghanistan, arms industry and the likes were sitting still as all. And there were a number of countries who also were still drinking from this poison Kool-Aid about the post-Cold War peace and dividend that turned out to not be much of a dividend at all. And we could see signs of this going back for the last 10 to 15 years. And so we forgot about it. So I would argue that it is not, and General Hodges brought this up, which always makes me smile, when you have people sitting in the Pentagon telling Ukraine that they're burning ammunition at too high of a rate. And it reminded me of what a senior general said to me in Iraq one day. He said, "Isn't it great that we have that 10,000-mile screwdriver back in the Pentagon telling us how to fight this conflict? It's so useful to have this advice." And I'm reminded of that we have someone sitting there and telling Ukraine not to shoot back because you're burning too much ammunition. So I think the problem here is a lack of our understanding of what was going to be required of not only the United States, but all of us Western allies to contemplate any sort of different non-counterinsurgency war going forward, be that with China or some other adversary. And so I don't buy into this thing that Ukraine has caused this drawdown. Instead, I would argue the way the Poles have, the Czechs have, and others, that it's taught them a lesson that they have to be prepared for the next conflict. All of you who had worked NATO understand that there are too many NATO countries who, when it was time for them to do a rotation in the Baltics or elsewhere, didn't have either the manpower, the capacity, or the equipment to do those rotations, because they just thought all they needed was something on paper and no one would ever call them to heel on, wait a minute, sending 14 guys and a broomstick is not the same as putting in the battalion you promised. So I think what Ukraine has caused is an exceptional evaluation of how poorly we had prepared ourselves and defended ourselves. And I think in the last National Defense Authorization Act, for the first time, Congress has put in multi-year purchasing for a number of weapon systems for each one of the services. And I think that's a recognition by Congress that we weren't doing this the right way to keep our defense industry up and running, so that if we needed something, we don't have to wait a year or two to have that come out.
Thanks, Deborah. I want to bring up one thing, and I think I'm not directing it specifically, but I think Sandy and John, I'd like to certainly hear your comments on it. On a couple of occasions, including yesterday on a webinar of the Foreign Council on Foreign Relations, the argument was made that Ukraine doesn't need Crimea to be economically viable, that Ukraine was viable when, before this attack a little over a year ago, they were doing just fine, and Russia occupied Crimea. I have my own thoughts, but yours, Sandy and John?
Yeah, I saw that webinar and was a bit surprised by that argument. I mean, yes, it's true that after the first invasion in 2014, there were efforts to manage the crisis, to bring about some kind of political settlement based on Minsk. And so the Ukrainian economy wasn't completely shut off from its export markets. Could have been worse, but they were living day by day at the mercy of the Russians. And we saw several incidents over the years, including the Kerch Strait incident, I remember at the end of 2018, where Ukrainian shipping was obstructed. So the idea that returning to that kind of status quo ante would be good enough for Ukraine is, I think, a hard sell. Plus, I think it's worth remembering, and John probably knows more about it than I, having been ambassador there. You know, everybody thinks that things started in 2014 with the invasion and the little green men and the annexation. But Yeltsin is not innocent. Even in the first years after independence in 1991, the Russians were already trying to undermine Ukrainian sovereignty, interfering in elections, using corrupt oligarchs to influence developments, harassing civil activities, funding NGOs to promote Russian nationalism and separatism. So Ukraine has to think about those precedents before it accepts the argument that going back to the status quo of 2014 is good enough. I think that's crazy.
John,
that does raise the question of who's going to enforce a political settlement if we ever got one. We may never get one. But Deborah raised the issue of outside peacekeepers. I agree that they would probably be needed in some fashion, but the Russians rejected even modest ideas for peacekeeping during the Minsk talks because they wanted to be able to control the situation on the ground, short of full occupation of the country. And now they'll want even more, even if they're driven to the bargaining table by events on the ground.
John, before you comment, I've been admonished in my introduction, I used little green men, and you did too, Sandy. I know both of us were using that in a sarcastic way. Of course, those were Russian regulars, and I guess we ought to acknowledge that. Anyway, John?
Look, it is conceivable to imagine an economically viable Ukraine without Crimea, albeit a much reduced and partly impoverished Ukraine. There are at least two reasons for that, actually three. The first are the resources in and around Crimea in its territorial waters, and there are serious hydrocarbons there. The second is the use Moscow has made of its control of Crimea, which was essentially to render the Ukrainian ports on the Azov Sea, Mariupol and Berdyansk, almost inoperable, without a word of complaint from the international community, including the person who in that CFR seminar was arguing that Ukraine could live just fine off Crimea. He did not seem particularly concerned the way the Russians abused Ukrainian access to world markets from the Sea of Azov. And three, once the Russians took Crimea, not only did they assert control over all of Crimea's territorial waters, but they suddenly were blocking all Ukraine hydrocarbon development and exploration in Black Sea waters that are part of Ukraine's non-Crimea territorial waters. So for all these reasons, this is a dreadful option. And then, of course, there are the military arguments that many of our panelists made.
If I could add just one point on that, Crimea has strategic significance for the entirety of the Black Sea. It is the pivot point from which when you can project power, create almost an A2AD air defense bubble, A2AD bubble over the entirety of the region. So if you're assuming you're going to have a long-term strategic confrontation with Russia for the long term, which I think is we have to assume, is certainly as long as Putin is there, you don't want to have Putin in control of that peninsula, because you have to assume he'll try to do what he's done in the past, leverage Crimea as a point through which to project Russian power, military power, throughout the Black Sea.
Luke, you had something you wanted to add as well.
I do, but I see Ben has a map. So I would like to yield my time to Ben, because when he has a map, he's going to say something important. So I want to hear what Ben has to say first.
Okay, Ben, it's time for you to say something important.
Yeah. Well, Luke is the master of using maps, by the way, but thanks, Luke, for giving me just a minute. Whoever thinks that Ukraine is viable, I mean, viable, not can survive, but viable with Russia controlling Crimea, has never actually looked at a map. I mean, it completely dominates Azov Sea. And so exactly as Sandy alluded to, when the Russian Navy, back before this special military operation, interdicted the Ukrainian naval vessels that were attempting to go around Crimea through the Kerch Strait. This is back when Mariupol and Berdansk were still viable Ukrainian ports. And the Russian Navy went out there and intercepted them and captured them. And of course, the claim by Russia was, well, this is Russian territorial water because this is Crimea, which is ours. So this is not just about seaports. This is about the whole so-called international rules-based order. And if Russia is allowed to make claims like they did this week while they knocked down our drone, that it was supposedly flying inside Russian airspace and an area that they had declared for their special military operation, all illegal claims by the Russians, you have to challenge that. And so clearly they are going to continue to claim all the air over Crimea. They're going to claim territorial waters around Crimea, and they're going to claim the exclusive economic zone around Crimea, which means exactly as John points out, that means they're going to have claims over the gas and other resources that are underneath around Crimea. So this is about, this is why my governor, I'm from Florida, my governor said this is some regional dispute. This is about the things that affect all of us: freedom of navigation, use of international airspace, sovereignty, as well as war crimes. So I can't imagine that some person with more than a high school degree actually thinks that Ukraine will be just fine, let the Russians go ahead and keep Crimea.
No, I just wanted to add to what everyone has said about the importance of Crimea to Ukraine's economic prosperity. It's not just about investors in Ukraine. I mean, we have Ian on with us, who is the leading expert on 3 Seas Initiative. He's been doing so much promoting this in Washington, and I suspect that a lot of the possibilities for private investment and outside investment in the 3 Seas investment fund have all been dried up because investors are very wary about investing in projects in Central and Eastern Europe because of what Russia's doing in Ukraine. So I think there's probably there could be a knock-on effect here. But we have the Ukrainian will, we have their momentum, we have the weapons and tools that they need, and they have the troops. Why wouldn't we give them the opportunity to finish the job now, so we don't have to do it again in 15 or 20 years after we freeze this conflict, let Russia use Ukraine to rearm and refit, and then we'll be doing this all over again. Let's just get it done now and help the Ukrainians do so.
Deborah?
So I wanted to bring up a broader energy thing other than just the hydrocarbons in the region. And I'm glad that Ben put up the map, and I'm hoping he puts it up again, because I don't think people understand the transit routes of the Black Sea, what it means for the movement of hydrocarbons from the Eastern Mediterranean and up the Danube. And I don't think they understand these transit routes. And so when you have Governor DeSantis and others talking about how this is regional, it affects U.S. companies who are heavily invested in the Eastern Med. It affects energy independence. And I don't know how they think the oil and gas is going to transit from through the Bosporus if it's getting blocked in the Black Sea, and how it gets back up the Danube to Europe, and how U.S. companies who are heavily invested in East Med gas, for example, are going to move those hydrocarbons. So I think there is a huge economic piece here where people forget about how the Black Sea is connected to these other major waterways. how energy gets transported, where it moves. I mean, when people talk about investing heavily in the East Med, how do they think it's going to get from point A to point B? On the wings of gentle zephyrs? I mean, I'm really astonished by the lack of understanding geographically where that the international relationship is of moving of goods and services, especially for energy security. So I just wanted to bring that up because I do think, I would bet half these people have not looked at that map and how Russia plays fast and loose with transit in that area, even before last year, where they were stopping tankers moving from the East Med elsewhere into the Black Sea. So I think, before, when we have these arguments, we ought to make clear that this is international transit for international economies. And it's great to be an isolationist, except you have to trade with someone at some point because it is a global commons, like it or not.
Deborah, in bringing this up, and it's come up a couple of times here, on our questions, the first one that I answered typed it, and it's come up in a couple of other observations that are online here. DeSantis, okay, we can talk about him. The other thing is this group, our group, Friends of Ukraine Network, are we having an impact? Are we trying to deal with these people that are making these, what I call Trump-Carlson caucus arguments? Yes, we are. I'm saying this to our audience. Yes, we're making every effort to. We're in the process today, even, of trying to set up an appointment with Governor DeSantis for one of our members who's in Florida. We're trying. It's a big job. I mean, I said in the introduction that the public perception of where this is and care about Ukraine is sliding in the wrong direction. We're one small group, but we're trying via this webinar, via the articles these gentlemen write, and Deborah writes, and webinars that they're all on to influence public opinion, but it's a big job. And that's why I emphasize, and I forget somebody else emphasized, the White House, I guess it was Ben, the White House needs to, for everything else they're doing, they need to stand up, make the unequivocal argument of Ukraine winning is in our American national best interest. It needs to be a major pushback from the biggest microphone in this country to all these, what I'll call know-nothings who haven't looked at Deborah's map. Another question or issue that has come up online is, looking for, I'll try and, do you see the fear of Russian disintegration after defeat in Ukraine as a bigger obstacle than nukes to the U.S. government's support of Ukrainian victory, including returning Crimea? I think we've got several people here that would like to respond to that. Ian, will you want to start?
We've been, ever since the collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989, there's been thinking and analysis done on whether or not the Soviet Union, whether or not Russia would go the same way the Soviet Union did. And there are tensions between regions and animosity towards Moscow that exist and that create a centrifugal dynamic in Russia. But I don't think it is a point where it's an imminent. It's imminent in terms of happening. Russia's going to have to degrade a lot more before Moscow's control over the different regions weakens to the point where you'll see a dissolution or fragmentation of the state. From what I can observe the administration, that is not a concern that's dominating their thinking. First and foremost is the concern of nuclear escalation triggered by this conflict. That's what causes them to hesitate, to be more decisive in their support of Ukraine.
Others? Yeah, Ben.
I think there's uncertainty. People are worried about, almost scared of winning, because we don't know exactly what happens. I think back in the old days, we knew who the number 2, number 3, number 4 guy was there, you know, based on who was standing up over Lenin's tomb during the big parades at Red Square. There's less certainty about that, but I heard Ann Applebaum say at Munich a few weeks ago, she said, we should not be scared of Russia collapsing or the Federation collapsing. We should not be worried about who might come next. Is certainly not going to be Thomas Jefferson, but it can't be any worse. But I hear this a lot. People say, oh, it might be somebody even worse than Putin. How do you have somebody worse than Putin? And actually, I think the next guy will be more focused on trying to consolidate his own power. And he'll have the opportunity to say, hey, that wasn't my war. That was Putin. And so I think we should not be scared of Ukraine winning and the outcome. Obviously, we have to be prepared for it, but I don't think we should be scared of that.
Bob, on this point, it's something I've thought about quite a bit recently. And, you know, looking at events around the region, to me, I think it's pretty clear that the Soviet Union didn't collapse in 1991. The collapse started then, and we're still seeing it play out today in different forms in different areas around the region. I think history has the ability to condense time. And when historians 300 years from now write about the collapse of the Soviet Union, they'll probably identify Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 as the most consequential act, if not the final act of this collapse, if indeed Russia does suffer a military defeat inside Ukraine. You have all these uncertainties that could appear after a Russian military defeat inside Ukraine. Obviously, the nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction is a major concern. But you'll have tens of thousands of young men disproportionately from ethnic minority groups who will be going home to not a very bright future, to regions of Russia that might have had low-level calls for independence or separatism in the past. You're going to have the proliferation of private military companies and the influence that they will bring to compete against these subnational groups for influence. You're going to have a lot of these different dynamics at play. So I don't think that the collapse of the Russian Federation is imminent, but I don't think we can completely rule it out. And I think at a minimum, we have to at least think about it. Otherwise, if it does happen and we're unprepared for the consequences, then we'll be all accused, of course, of getting it wrong once again. I think we probably had similar discussions in the late 1980s about the Soviet Union, and then we saw what happened in '91. We should be having similar discussions and take it more seriously today with the Russian Federation collapsing.
I agree. Our time is running out. Looking at the question and answers, many of which are comments, I think in most cases, I'm sorry if I'm misinterpreting them. I think most of the issues have been or are being discussed in ways other than just direct answers to the questions as posed. There is one, and I think General Hodges has already addressed this, maybe not just General Hodges. Is it too late for the ATACMS and F-16s? Is there a lead time for training, maintenance, and support? Ben?
So, two things. Absolutely, it's not too late. I mean, we have stuff. And that was my point earlier. If the administration says, we're going to win, and it's going to happen this year. It needs to happen this year. It can happen this year. Let's get moving. I mean, we have the capability to do this stuff. Now, obviously, the secretary and the chairman will have to work with the White House to look at the risks associated with deterrence vis-a-vis China, or where are these things coming from? But when you look at the sourcing solution, for example, for the ground-launched small diameter bombs, it's basically as they are produced, as they come off the assembly line, versus taking what we already have, taking ATACMS that we already have. When somebody gives you 3 different reasons for why they're not going to do something or don't want to do something, that tells you they're searching for reasons versus we can't because this. And I have heard multiple different reasons like, well, we need these for China, or we don't have enough, or they're going out of They're going out of use anyway. Well, which is it? So I think we could deliver ATACMS, we could deliver Gray Eagle drones immediately. We could accelerate, or we could deliver our own ground launch small diameter bombs. So that's 3. The F-16 thing. I'm not an Air Force guy, but I have talked to some very, very senior Air Force officers who have said, you take a Ukrainian pilot that's got, say, 500 hours in the cockpit already, in just a few months, they'll be proficient on that aircraft. And then I just saw today that President Duda says that the Poles are going to hand over 4 MiGs, I think. So there are things that could be delivered very quickly, but this is about political will. You know, the tendency has been to blame industry also. It'll take too long to make these things. But we haven't put down $1 yet until just last month. So defense industry is not a charity. They have thousands of employees. They have very complex supply chains. They're not going to make 500,000 rounds of something and then hope the government wants to buy it. So this is about political will. Same thing over here in Germany. Armin Pappegger, the head of Rheinmetall, that guy is ready to start bending metal right now. But the German government has not put a single euro down for him to start doing that.
You know, I'm trying to get to most of what has been put online as questions. One question, the Russian fleet and its abilities to both harm and control Crimea and more. We haven't talked specifically about the naval firepower and what can be done about it. And it's, I suppose I go to Ben for this one, at least first.
So the Russian Navy has been just as embarrassing as the Russian Air Force at delivering real capability for Russian armed forces, fortunately, because they do not have this joint culture. They don't have this integrated approach to warfighting, fortunately. We didn't either until the Congress passed a law that made us do it, because it's not a natural thing. The Russian Navy, the Black Sea Fleet, which I had thought was really going to be something, right now is basically a non-factor, except when they sortie out to launch caliber missiles, and then they return back into Sevastopol, where they've got protection from Ukrainian anti-ship missiles. So they're not the threat that they could be, but yet only because they're sitting there in Sevastopol are they able to have influence over the movement of grain ships out of Odessa. I mean, that's the only thing that they are actually providing. If we enabled Ukraine to start hitting Sevastopol with precision weapons, they would have to move. They already moved their submarines out after the first drone hit that place back a few months ago. They would have to relocate to Novorossiysk, which is not nearly as big or capable for taking care of the Black Sea Fleet. So this would severely disrupt their ability to conduct any sort of naval operations.
John Cornwell, I hope that answered your question. Given we're at the end of our time, but I want to have a lightning round and have everybody have a closing comment. There's so much to say. We could go on for hours just among ourselves, but I'll do it as I see it on the screen here. Sandy, lightning round, last comment.
Well, just to repeat, we need to commit to Ukrainian victory. As Ben and others have argued, we continue to evade what our real objective is. And if we can commit to victory and get serious about putting the means behind it, then the Ukrainians can take back a lot more territory and at least improve the correlation of forces at the negotiating table. I don't think a settlement is readily available, but let's put the Ukrainians in a position to at least have the choice whether to engage or not.
Ian, you're muted.
My apologies there. Just 2 points. One, I just reiterate the point that, you know, Crimea has to be returned to Ukraine. That's what the Ukrainians want. That's their government's position. That's their parliament's position. That's their people's position. There's absolutely no reason why we shouldn't be fully behind that. If they want to ratchet back their goals, that's their call. But we should support what their goals are, and these are totally legitimate goals. Let's not make Crimea a monument to the potential successes of imperialism. Second, as we think about going forward, there are two big events that are coming up that we ought to leverage to increase the flow of Western assistance to Ukraine, both in terms of the security equipment and the sanctions that we put on Russia. Those are the IMF World Bank meetings coming up this spring, and there's the NATO summit. Those are both good opportunities to ratchet down the sanctions on Russia, so they really, really hurt. And NATO, of course, is a perfect opportunity to leverage forward the assistance that the Ukraine needs to win this war on its terms. Thanks.
Thank you, Ian. Luke?
I'll keep it short. We have to start wanting Ukraine to win more than we just hope that Russia's going to lose.
Deborah?
Yeah, I was going to say Ukraine can win, Russia can lose, and it's not the job of the United States or NATO to make sure Russia doesn't lose. And we should stop trying to knit Russia back together again. That's a Russian problem. Let them figure that out.
John?
We need an Oval Office speech by the president laying out why the United States has vital interest in helping Ukraine defeat Russia. It should be coordinated with the Republicans on the Hill. The American people would love to see high-level bipartisan political aim. Do that, you will buck up American public support, including among Republicans. And at the same time, we need to ramp up defense production, not just to ensure that Ukraine gets what it needs, but to make sure we've got enough for our own needs, not just in Europe, but in the Pacific.
Ben?
Yeah, agree with what John just said. At Munich Security Conference, Senate Republican leader Mitch McConnell stood up with a very large Republican delegation that was part of the U.S. congressional delegation in Munich. And he said, I am here with all of the Republican leadership to demonstrate that we support Ukraine, we support NATO, we support America's interest in Europe, because it is in our core interest that this works. So he's going to be a willing partner, and he was clearly trying to create distance from the right-wing crazies that don't understand or have not embraced this. So I think if the president had Senator McConnell standing there with him, that would be very compelling.
Thank you, Ben. I'd make one comment about how you worded that. Conservatives, I can't use that. I'm a conservative. These are isolationists, period. That's not part of conservatism, certainly not the Ronald Reagan.
I didn't say conservative, I said right-wing crazies.
Well, right-wing means conservative, I think, but you did throw in crazies. Look, my closing comments are that I very much appreciate everybody that's on this program. I appreciate those that have signed in to listen. If we haven't answered any questions that you want to, if you can forward them to me through the U.S. Ukraine website, I will see if we can get them answered. I appreciate all the attendance, and we'll be back again because we're 24/7, all of us, trying to get us engaged the way we need to be so that Ukraine can win. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of the day.